The courthouse stood like a monument to order and consequence, its gray stone walls towering over the street outside. On this particular morning, the building seemed to hum with a quiet tension, as though it sensed something unusual was about to unfold. People streamed through the metal detectors, lawyers with briefcases, officers in pressed uniforms, reporters clutching notepads, and families whose expressions carried a mix of hope, fear, and exhaustion. Inside courtroom 3B, wooden benches creaked as spectators settled in. The air smelled faintly of old paper and floor polish. Sunlight filtered through tall, narrow windows, casting pale stripes across the floor. Conversations were hushed but constant, whispers bouncing between rows like nervous echoes. At the center of the gallery sat a young couple, shoulders tight, eyes fixed forward. Between them was their daughter Emma, barely 3 years old. She swung her small legs back and forth, sneakers tapping softly against the bench. Her brown curls refused to stay neatly tied, and her wide eyes absorbed everything: the high ceiling, the stern-looking bailiff, the flags behind the judge's bench. Emma didn't understand why they were there. She only knew that this place felt different, quieter, heavier. Her mother adjusted Emma on her lap, whispering softly, "Just sit still, sweetheart." Emma nodded, though her attention quickly drifted again. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the bench, fascinated by the way adults spoke in low, serious tones. Across the aisle, a uniformed police officer stood near the front of the courtroom. Beside him sat a dog. Not just any dog. The German Shepherd was large, powerful, and impossibly still. His posture was straight, his ears alert, his dark eyes focused forward. A badge gleamed on the handler's chest, and a patch on his sleeve read K9 Unit. The dog's leash rested loosely in the officer's hand, a sign of absolute trust. This dog had been here before. Courtrooms weren't new to him. Chaos didn't rattle him. Noise didn't distract him. But children were different. Emma noticed him immediately. Her legs stopped swinging. Her fingers curled tightly around the bench. Her gaze locked onto the dog with the kind of intensity only children possess: pure, unfiltered curiosity. Her mouth opened slightly, as if she were seeing something magical rather than trained and disciplined. She leaned toward her mother and whispered, not quietly enough, "Mommy Doggy." Her mother glanced down, smiled nervously, and whispered back, "Yes, baby, but remember, we have to be quiet." Emma nodded again, but her eyes never left the dog. The judge entered, and the bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose. Emma copied them awkwardly, standing on the bench with help from her father, her tiny hand gripping his sleeve. She looked around proudly, pleased to be doing what everyone else was doing. When they sat again, the courtroom settled into its formal rhythm. The judge began reviewing the case. Legal language filled the room, phrases like evidence submission, probable cause, and chain of custody. Most people listened closely, aware that every word mattered. Emma listened too, though the words meant nothing to her. To her, the room was a collection of sounds and faces. The judge's voice was deep and steady. The attorneys spoke sharply, like they were competing. Shoes clicked on the floor. Papers rustled. And then there was the dog. He didn't move. Emma frowned. She had seen dogs before, at parks, on sidewalks, pulling on leashes, barking at squirrels. This dog was different. He sat like a statue, disciplined and calm, as if carved from stone. Her curiosity deepened. She slid off her mother's lap and stood between her parents, peeking over the bench again. Her small finger lifted, hovering in the air, though she hadn't pointed yet. At the front, the prosecutor gestured toward the K9 handler. "Officer Reynolds," she said, "please explain the role your K9 partner played in this case." Officer Reynolds stepped forward. His voice was measured but proud. "This is Max," he said. "He's been with the department for 6 years. He's trained in scent tracking, narcotics detection, and search and rescue operations." Max remained still, but his ears flicked slightly at the sound of his name. Emma's breath caught. She leaned closer to her mother and whispered, "He knows his name." Her mother pressed her lips together, trying not to smile. Officer Reynolds continued, describing late nights, dangerous searches, and moments where Max's instincts had made the difference between success and failure. The courtroom listened attentively. Some nodded, others scribbled notes. Emma listened in her own way. She watched Max's chest rise and fall. She noticed how his eyes followed his handler's movements. She tilted her head when Max tilted his. Something about him felt important. Important in a way Emma couldn't explain. The tension in the room slowly built as evidence was discussed. This wasn't just a routine case, it carried weight. The outcome mattered. People leaned forward, fully engaged. And yet, amid all the seriousness, Emma shifted again. She raised her hand slightly, as though she were in school. Her father gently pulled it down, whispering, "Not now, sweetheart." She nodded obediently, but her finger twitched. Her gaze returned to Max. The dog shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance, his nails clicking softly against the floor. The sound was barely audible, but Emma noticed. Her eyes widened. She stood up again, steadier this time. Without hesitation, without fear, without understanding the significance of what she was doing, Emma lifted her arm and pointed straight at the police dog. The motion was small, innocent, natural. But something about it, something about the timing, the certainty in her tiny hand, the quiet confidence of her gesture, sent a ripple through the room. A few heads turned. Then more. A whisper stopped mid-sentence. The judge paused. Officer Reynolds glanced over. Max turned his head slightly. The courtroom, moments ago filled with legal arguments and procedural focus, began to shift, though no one yet understood why. Emma held her finger steady, her face serious now, as if she had recognized something important. "He's the good one," she said softly. And just like that, the air in courtroom 3B changed. The silence that followed Emma's words lingered longer than anyone expected. "He's the good one." The sentence itself was simple, childish, even, but something about the way she said it made the courtroom hesitate. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Yet it carried a certainty that cut through the tension like a blade through fog. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The judge cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, glancing toward the gallery. "Let's maintain order," he said calmly, though his eyes lingered on the child a second longer than necessary. Emma's mother pulled her gently back onto her lap, whispering an apology under her breath. Her face burned with embarrassment. This was not the place for interruptions, especially from a toddler. But something had already shifted. Officer Reynolds felt it. He had stood in dozens of courtrooms, testified under pressure, faced aggressive cross-examinations. He knew when a room was tense, when it was skeptical, when it was hostile. This felt different. He glanced down at Max. The German shepherd remained composed, but his ears were forward now, his attention subtly divided between his handler and the small child who had pointed at him. Max's gaze flicked toward Emma for half a second before returning forward, as if acknowledging her without breaking discipline. Reynolds swallowed. Max didn't react to children like that. He was trained not to. Yet something about Emma's presence had cut through years of conditioning, not enough to break it, but enough to be felt. The prosecutor resumed questioning, her voice steady. "Officer Reynolds, can you explain how Max assisted during the search on the night of April 17th? "Yes, ma'am," Reynolds replied, grounding himself. "Max tracked the suspect's scent from the vehicle to a wooded area behind the property. Without his work, we likely would not have located the evidence." As he spoke, images flickered in his mind. Dark woods, flashing lights, Max pulling forward with unwavering focus, leading them where no human eye could see. Emma listened intently, though she didn't understand the words. What she understood was tone. She understood importance. Her small hand clenched in her mother's jacket. Max's name kept coming up. Her mother leaned down and whispered, "Sweetie, remember, we stay quiet now." Emma nodded again, but her eyes never wavered. Something tugged at her, deep and instinctive. She didn't know why she felt it, only that she did. To Emma, Max wasn't just a dog sitting beside a man in uniform. He was something else, something strong and safe. The defense attorney stood. He was sharp, confident, and skeptical by nature. His eyes narrowed slightly as he approached the podium. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "isn't it true that dogs can be influenced by their handlers, that they can respond to subtle cues?" Reynolds had heard this argument many times. "No, sir. Max is trained to work independently. His alerts are based solely on scent." The attorney nodded slowly, packing. "Yet we are expected to believe that an animal's actions are completely objective." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Emma frowned. She didn't like the man's voice. It sounded cold. She shifted on her mother's lap and whispered, "He doesn't like the dog." Her mother stiffened, heart pounding. She glanced around, praying no one had heard. But the bailiff had. So had the court reporter. And so had the judge. The judge's gavel tapped lightly. "Counsel," he said, "let's proceed." The attorney paused, clearly irritated, but continued. Max remained still. His breathing was slow, controlled. But Reynolds felt the leash tighten just slightly, not from tension, but from awareness. Max sensed the shift too. As the questioning continued, something unexpected happened. Max lowered his head slightly. Not in submission. In focus. Emma noticed immediately. Her eyes widened, and she leaned forward again, instinctively lifting her arm. Her mother caught her wrist gently. "Emma," she whispered, pleading now. Emma hesitated, but only for a moment. Then Max lifted his head and looked directly at her. Not past her. Not through her. At her. It was brief, barely noticeable to anyone else. But Emma felt it like a spark. She gasped softly. "He's looking at me," she whispered. Her father glanced over, startled. He followed her gaze and saw Max's eyes return forward, posture unchanged. But the moment had already landed. The defense attorney scoffed slightly. "Your Honor, with all due respect, relying on a dog's actions introduces reasonable doubt." That's when the judge leaned back. His gaze drifted, not to the attorneys, but to the gallery. To the child. Emma sat very still now. Her earlier excitement had settled into something quieter. Her brows were knit together, as though she were trying to solve a puzzle far too big for her age. The judge had seen many things in his career: anger, lies, fear, grief. But this was something else. He cleared his throat. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "how long have you worked with Max?" "6 years, Your Honor." "And in that time," the judge continued, "has he ever falsely alerted?" "No, sir." The judge nodded slowly. Emma didn't understand the exchange, but she understood the pause. She understood that something important was happening. Her small voice cut through again, not loud, not disruptive. "He's brave," she said. This time, there was no mistaking it. The courtroom froze. Her mother covered her mouth, mortified. The defense attorney stared. The prosecutor blinked. Officer Reynolds felt his chest tighten. Max's ears flicked. The judge held up a hand, not in reprimand but in stillness. He looked at Emma gently. "And why do you think that?" The question hung in the air. Everyone waited. Emma tilted her head, thinking as hard as she could. "Because," she said slowly, "he sits when everyone is mad." A breath moved through the room like a wave. No one laughed. No one spoke. The judge nodded once quietly. "Thank you," he said. "That will be all." Emma smiled, satisfied. Max exhaled softly. And in that moment, the courtroom realized this was no longer just a case about evidence. Something deeper had entered the room, something that would not be ignored. The judge's words, "That will be all," should have ended the interruption. But they didn't. They settled into the room instead, heavy and lingering, like dust that refused to fall. The courtroom resumed its formal rhythm, yet something fragile had been cracked open. The attorneys continued, voices measured, but their words now floated over an undercurrent of unease and reflection. Officer Reynolds returned to his position beside Max. He rested his hand lightly on the dog's back, not as reassurance but as grounding. The familiar warmth beneath his palm steadied him. Max was calm, but Reynolds wasn't sure he was. The child's words replayed in his head. "He sits when everyone is mad." Reynolds swallowed hard. That sentence, so small, so simple, had somehow captured 6 years of training, sacrifice, and moments no one ever saw. The prosecutor shifted topics, moving deeper into the timeline of the case. Photographs were entered into evidence. Locations were described. Dates and times stacked upon one another. Emma's attention drifted briefly as the language became dull again. She swung her feet, traced patterns on her mother's sleeve, then looked back to Max. He hadn't moved. He never moved when things got loud. That was something Reynolds had taught him early on. Years earlier, when Max was still a young K-9 prospect, he had struggled with noise, sirens, shouting, chaos. The world overwhelmed him. Other handlers had doubted whether he'd make it through training. But Reynolds had seen something else. Patience. Focus. A quiet strength that didn't announce itself. They had trained relentlessly. Early mornings, late nights, rain-soaked fields, long hours repeating the same drills until muscle memory replaced fear. Sit when things get loud. Stay when people panic. Watch, wait, protect. Reynolds glanced down at Max again. The dog's posture was flawless, but his breathing had slowed even more. He wasn't just calm, he was present. The defense attorney resumed his questioning, pressing harder now, his tone sharpening. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "isn't it possible that your emotional bond with the dog could influence your interpretation of his behavior?" Reynolds straightened. "No, sir," he replied firmly. "Max doesn't respond to emotion, he responds to training." Emma frowned again. She didn't like this man at all. She tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Why is he mad?" she whispered. Her mother leaned down, whispering back, "He's not mad, honey. He's just asking questions." Emma considered this carefully. She watched the attorney pace. She watched his hand slice the air as he spoke. She watched how Max didn't flinch, not even when the man raised his voice slightly for emphasis. Emma made a decision. She slipped from her mother's lap and stood quietly, gripping the bench. This time no one stopped her. Her finger lifted again, but she didn't point. She just watched. The judge noticed. So did Reynolds. And Max. The dog's ears twitched, almost imperceptibly. The defense attorney continued. "You expect this court to believe that a dog can distinguish truth from coincidence." Reynolds opened his mouth to answer, but the judge raised a hand. "Counsel," the judge said, "we are not here to debate philosophy. Continue with relevant questions." The attorney bit back his frustration. A murmur passed through the gallery. Emma felt the shift. She didn't understand court rules, but she understood fairness. She understood when someone was being questioned too hard. Her voice, soft but clear, slipped out again. "He's trying," she said. This time, the sound didn't shock the room. It hushed it. The judge closed his eyes briefly. Reynolds felt his throat tighten. The prosecutor lowered her pen. The defense attorney froze mid-step. Emma's mother covered her face with one hand, overwhelmed. The judge looked directly at Emma. She met his gaze without fear. "Who is trying?" he asked gently. Emma pointed, not accusing, not dramatic, but sure. "The dog," she said. "He's trying to help." A long breath moved through the courtroom. No one laughed. No one objected. The judge leaned forward slightly. "And how do you know that?" Emma shrugged, the way only a child could. "Because he waits," she said, "and waiting is hard." Something in that broke. Not loudly. Quietly. Reynolds felt his eyes sting. He blinked hard, jaw tightening. Max shifted his weight for the first time since entering the courtroom. He adjusted, then sat again, steady as stone. "Waiting." The judge nodded slowly. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "you may continue." But his voice had changed. So had the room. As testimony resumed, Reynolds spoke with renewed clarity. He described the night of the search in greater detail: the rain, the darkness, the suspect fleeing into the trees. He described how Max had pulled forward despite exhaustion, how he'd paused at critical points, recalibrating, waiting for direction only when needed. Emma listened like it was a story. She imagined the dark woods. She imagined Max walking carefully, nose low, ears alert. She imagined him stopping, sitting, waiting, just like now. She smiled. During a short recess, the courtroom shifted again. People stood, stretched, whispered. The judge exited briefly. Reynolds knelt beside Max, adjusting his collar. "You're doing good, buddy," he murmured quietly. Emma watched from the bench. Her feet carried her forward before her parents could stop her. She stood at the aisle, small and unsure, but determined. Reynolds noticed and froze. Emma took a step closer. Max looked at her fully this time. Not working. Not alerting. Just looking. Emma reached out slowly, stopping inches from his head. "May I?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds hesitated, then nodded. Emma's fingers touched Max's fur. It was warm. Solid. Real. She smiled wide. "You're a good boy," she said. Max didn't move. But his tail wagged once. Just once. And in that tiny motion, something sealed itself in the hearts of everyone watching. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a place where truth, patience, and innocence had quietly taken root. And the case, everyone could feel it now, would never be the same. When court reconvened after recess, the atmosphere felt heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. The judge returned to the bench, his expression composed but thoughtful. The bailiff called everyone to order. Conversations faded into silence, yet something lingered beneath the stillness. It wasn't tension alone, it was awareness. Emma was back on her mother's lap, her small hand resting against her chest as if she were guarding something important. She watched Max closely, her eyes calm now, almost serious. Max sat exactly where he had before. Waiting. The defense attorney rose again, straightening his jacket as though preparing for a battle he hadn't expected. His confidence was still there, but it had thinned. "Officer Reynolds," he said, "let's return to the night in question." Reynolds nodded, steady. "You testified that the K-9 tracked the suspect into a wooded area," the attorney continued. "Isn't it true that officers had already searched that area earlier that evening?" "Yes," Reynolds replied, "but not thoroughly. Visibility was poor and the terrain." "So you're saying the dog found what trained officers could not?" the attorney interrupted. Reynolds met his gaze. "Yes." A ripple passed through the gallery. Emma frowned again. She didn't like interruptions. The attorney paced slowly. "Or," he said, "is it possible that confirmation bias played a role, that the dog responded to your expectations?" Reynolds inhaled slowly. He had prepared for this. Max doesn't know my expectations, he said. He knows scent, that's it. The attorney stopped packing. Then explain, he said sharply, why the evidence was found exactly where officers later focused their search. Before Reynolds could respond, Emma shifted. Her tiny fingers tightened around her mother's sleeve. He already knew, she whispered. Her mother froze. The judge heard. So did everyone else. The judge leaned forward. Young lady, he said gently, what do you mean? Emma blinked, surprised she'd been addressed again. She thought carefully. Dogs don't guess, she said. They smell. The courtroom went silent. Again. The defense attorney scoffed softly. Your Honor. The judge raised a hand. Let her finish, he said. Emma swallowed, then continued. My dog at home knows when I hide my shoes, she explained. He doesn't see them, he just knows. A few quiet smiles flickered, but no one laughed. The judge nodded slowly. Thank you. The attorney opened his mouth to object, then closed it. Something about challenging a 3-year-old's logic felt unwise. The judge turned back to Reynolds. Continue. Reynolds did. He described how Max had stopped abruptly that night, how he'd sat down hard, alerting with unmistakable clarity, how Reynolds had trusted him instantly. And what did you find? The prosecutor asked. A discarded jacket, Reynolds replied, and beneath it the weapon. A murmur rippled through the room. Emma's eyes widened. He found it, she whispered proudly. The defense attorney exhaled sharply and sat down. For the first time since the trial began, he looked unsure. The judge called for a brief pause. As people shifted again, whispers filled the room, but this time they weren't skeptical. They were impressed. Emma leaned into her mother's shoulder. Did Max win? She asked quietly. Her mother kissed her hair. Not yet, baby. Across the room, Reynolds crouched beside Max again. You okay? He murmured. Max's ears flicked. He was. But Reynolds wasn't. He had trusted Max with his life before, trusted him in dark alleys and empty fields. But today felt different. Today a child had seen Max not as a tool, not as evidence, but as truth itself. The judge returned. Defense, he said. Do you have further questions regarding the K-9's involvement? The attorney hesitated, then shook his head. No, Your Honor. A quiet gasp passed through the gallery. The prosecutor rose next. Officer Reynolds, she said, in your professional opinion, was Max's alert reliable? Yes, Reynolds said firmly. And based on your experience, would you trust his judgment again? Without hesitation, Reynolds replied, with my life. Emma smiled. Max shifted slightly and sat taller. The judge leaned back, folding his hands. Very well, he said. The court accepts the K-9 evidence as credible. The words landed like thunder. Emma didn't understand what had been decided, but she felt it. Something good had happened. As proceedings moved forward, Emma grew quieter, the weight of the room finally settling on her small frame. She yawned, resting her head against her mother's chest, eyes still drifting toward Max. He noticed. When the judge announced the next phase of the trial, Emma's eyelids fluttered. Before she drifted off, she murmured one last thing. He waited, she said softly, that's why. Reynolds felt it hit him then, harder than anything else that day. Waiting. That was what Max did best. When danger rose. When voices clashed. When people doubted. He waited. And sometimes, waiting was the bravest thing of all. As the gavel struck, marking the end of the session, people stood slowly, as if reluctant to break the spell. The story was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about trust. about patience, about a dog who waited and a child who noticed. And outside the courtroom, the world was already beginning to change. The courtroom felt different the moment everyone sat down again. It wasn't louder. It wasn't calmer. It was heavier, as if every person in the room understood they were approaching something final. Emma stirred on her mother's lap, half awake now. She rubbed her eyes with one small fist and looked around, disoriented. The bright lights, the wooden benches, the serious faces, it all came rushing back. Her gaze found Max instantly, as if pulled by an invisible thread. He was still there, still sitting, still waiting. Emma relaxed. The judge adjusted his papers slowly, deliberately. He had presided over thousands of cases in his career, but something about this one lingered in his thoughts. Not the evidence alone, strong as it was, but the quiet moments in between. The moments that didn't make transcripts. He glanced briefly at the child in the gallery. Then he spoke. "We will now proceed to closing statements." The prosecutor stood first. Her voice was clear, firm, but not aggressive. She laid out the evidence piece by piece, the timeline, the recovered weapon, the jacket, the scent trail. She spoke of responsibility and public safety, of trust in trained professionals and the tools they used. "And finally," she said, gesturing subtly toward Max, "we must remember that justice often depends on those who cannot speak for themselves, but whose actions speak loudly nonetheless." Emma lifted her head. She didn't know why, but she felt that sentence was important. The defense attorney rose next. He hesitated. That alone was enough to catch attention. His argument was shorter now, less theatrical. He spoke about reasonable doubt, about caution, about not allowing emotion to cloud judgment. But even as he spoke, his eyes drifted, not to the jury, not to the judge, but briefly, unwillingly to the dog. And then to the child. Emma met his gaze. She didn't glare. She didn't smile. She simply watched. When he finished, he sat down more slowly than before. The judge nodded once. "Members of the jury," he said, "you may deliberate." The jury filed out, their expressions unreadable. The waiting began. Minutes stretched. Then hours. Emma grew restless. She slid down from her mother's lap and sat on the floor, coloring quietly with a crayon one of the bailiffs had given her. She drew a dog, big ears, a round body, a badge on its chest. She held it up proudly to her father. "That's Max," she said. Her father smiled softly. "That's him." Across the room, Reynolds noticed. His chest tightened again. He turned away, blinking. The jury returned late in the afternoon. Everyone stood. Emma stood too, gripping the bench, her heart pounding even though she didn't know why. The judge received the paper, read it carefully, then looked up. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." A hush fell so deep it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. The foreperson stood. "In the matter before the court," she said, "we find the defendant guilty." The word echoed. Guilty. A collective breath released. Some gasped. Some closed their eyes. Some bowed their heads. Emma didn't react at first. Then she looked at Max. He hadn't moved. But Reynolds felt it, the slight shift of his weight, the controlled exhale. "Done." Emma clapped once before her mother could stop her. Then she froze, realizing it might not be allowed. The judge looked down. For a long moment, no one knew what he would do. Then he smiled. Just a little. Order was restored. Sentencing would follow later. The courtroom began to empty, voices rising in low murmurs. Reporters hurried out, phones already in hand. But Emma stayed focused. She tugged her mother's hand. "Can I say bye?" Her mother hesitated, then looked at Reynolds. He nodded. Emma walked over slowly, carefully, as if approaching something sacred. Max watched her, calm and attentive. She stopped in front of him. "You waited," she said again, as if confirming something she had learned. "That was brave." She reached out and patted his head. Max stayed still, but his tail wagged. This time twice. Reynolds laughed softly, the sound surprising even himself. "Yeah," he said quietly, "he was brave." As they left the courthouse later, Emma held her drawing tightly. Outside, cameras flashed, microphones extended, voices overlapping. But Emma didn't look back. She had already found what she came for. Inside the courtroom, long after the benches emptied and the lights dimmed, one truth remained clear to everyone who had witnessed it. Justice had been served, not just by law, but by patience, by trust, and by a child who saw courage in the act of waiting. By the time the courthouse doors swung open to the late afternoon sunlight, the story had already begun to escape its walls. Whispers turned into conversation, conversation into social media posts, and social media into news coverage. A simple scene, an unlikely moment of innocence and courage, was capturing attention far beyond the local court. Reporters jostled for positions outside, cameras flashing, microphones extended. The courthouse steps were alive with voices replaying what had just unfolded inside. They spoke of the verdict, yes, but even more of the small child and the police dog whose silent partnership had softened the courtroom in ways words could scarcely describe. "Have you ever seen anything like that?" one journalist asked a fellow correspondent. "A 3-year-old pointing at a K9 and making everyone stop. It's surreal." The video clips began to circulate immediately. Someone had recorded a small portion of the hearing on their phone, a shaky, grainy video that caught the exact moment Emma had lifted her finger at Max. The courtroom paused mid-proceeding, Reynolds kneeling quietly by his dog, the judge nodding in silent acknowledgement. For those who watched the clip online, it was mesmerizing. A child's instinct, a dog's composure, a room frozen in awe. It struck a chord. Inside the courthouse, Officer Reynolds stood with Max, gathering the few belongings they would need before heading out. He didn't comment much, letting the attention flow around them. Max was calm, obedient, but Reynolds could feel the unusual energy. He had handled K9 teams through high-stress events before, but nothing felt quite like this. Something about Emma, the small, observant, intuitive child, had magnified the dog's presence into something almost mythic. Emma clung to her mother's hand, her drawing of Max still tucked under her arm. She didn't care about the cameras, the reporters, or the murmurs. To her, today was about understanding, about noticing, about telling the truth in the way only a child could. She didn't fully grasp why people were amazed, but she knew that Max had been brave, and that waiting, sitting still when everyone else was shouting, was somehow the right thing. "Mommy," she whispered, tilting her head, "did Max do a good job?" Her mother smiled softly, brushing a curl from Emma's forehead. "Yes, baby, the best job anyone could have done." Reynolds glanced down, almost incredulous. A 3-year-old had boiled down 6 years of training, countless cases, and life-or-death situations into a single, simple observation. Waiting is bravery. It was astonishing, humbling. The local news crew approached, asking if Reynolds would comment. He shook his head. "The dog did his job, I just handle him," he said. He smiled faintly, glancing toward Emma. "But maybe she gets it better than I do." The reporters scribbled notes feverishly. And then the story began to spread. By the evening, the courthouse steps were empty, but the story had grown wings. Social media users called Emma the little girl who understands justice and Max the K9 hero who waited. Local news channels ran the footage repeatedly, analyzing the child's gestures, the dog's calm demeanor, and the courtroom reactions. Every clip included the pivotal moment: Emma pointing, Max sitting, and the judge pausing. The video went viral, not because of drama or theatrics, but because of sincerity and truth. Back at home, Emma's parents kept her away from the screens. They allowed her to continue drawing pictures of Max, coloring the dog with bold strokes and a wide smile. But they couldn't escape the notifications on their phones. Friends, relatives, and neighbors were already texting, calling, and messaging. "Did you see this? Your daughter is famous," one read. Another said, "I've never seen a courtroom like this before." Emma didn't understand fame. She didn't need to, but she understood the connection she had made. And in a way only a child could, she knew she had participated in something important. Reynolds returned to the K-9 unit the next morning. Max seemed no different from any other day, but the attention had left its mark on the officers around them. They spoke softly, quietly about the child's gesture and the shift it caused in the courtroom. For years, they had relied on dogs, instincts, and training, but they hadn't seen a human reaction reflect so clearly the work of a K-9 in action. It was a validation and a reminder of why they did what they did. In the weeks that followed, local papers ran feature stories. 3-year-old reminds courtroom how bravery can be quiet, and K-9 hero and tiny witness steal hearts. Interviews with Officer Reynolds highlighted Max's heroics in detail, tracking suspects, recovering evidence, and saving lives during dangerous searches. But the emphasis always returned to Emma, the small child whose innocence had punctuated the legal proceedings in a way no lawyer, officer, or judge could have predicted. Community members began to respond. Local schools invited Emma's family to speak about bravery and responsibility, even for the youngest citizens. Police departments shared stories of Max's work alongside pictures of him sitting patiently while the toddler observed. Everywhere, people saw a message. Courage could be measured in quiet moments. Patience could be heroic. And a child's perspective could reveal truths adults sometimes missed. Reynolds received emails and letters from strangers. Some spoke of how their own children noticed things in unexpected ways. Others sent messages to thank him and Max for their service. Some simply marveled at the courtroom clip, replaying it repeatedly to feel the calm and clarity it brought. For the first time, he realized that a dog's work didn't just affect the cases. They could touch hearts in profound ways, bridging the gap between law enforcement and community. At home, Emma continued to ask about Max. "Does he remember me?" she asked one evening, brushing her hair before bed. Her mother laughed softly. "Of course he does. He never forgets someone who notices him." Emma smiled, clutching her drawing tightly. "I want to see him again," she whispered. Her parents exchanged glances. They didn't yet know how or when, but they felt it too. The connection was real and it was lasting. Meanwhile, the story continued to grow. Social media posts turned into op-eds. Local news turned into national coverage. By the end of the month, major networks had featured segments. The toddler who understood bravery and a child, a K-9 and a lesson in patience. Experts weighed in about child psychology and human-animal bonds. The narrative became larger than the case itself. Emma's voice, innocent and clear, had amplified Max's quiet heroism to a national audience. And through it all, Emma remained herself, curious, observant, and honest. She didn't seek attention. She didn't want it. She only wanted to know what was right, and to see Max rewarded for waiting, for doing his job, for being brave without boasting. In the end, the courthouse episode was remembered not just as a case with a verdict, but as a story of patience, trust, and human connection. A child had reminded a room full of adults that courage was not always loud, that truth could be simple, and that sometimes the quietest gestures, like sitting still, like lifting a finger, could speak louder than words. And in that quiet lesson, the world outside the courthouse took notice. The courtroom moment, the tiny finger, the calm dog, the child's quiet voice, was no longer confined to the walls of the county courthouse. By the following week, it had traveled far beyond. Social media posts multiplied like wildfire. Hashtags such as Toddler Witness and K-9 Hero began trending. Video clips, once shaky and short, were shared across networks, edited into slow-motion highlights of Emma pointing at Max, the dog sitting perfectly still, the judge pausing mid-proceeding. Reynolds watched the attention with quiet disbelief. He had spent years training K-9 units, working long nights, enduring dangerous situations where the stakes were life and death. But this was something else. Here was a 3-year-old, innocent yet keenly observant, and a dog whose training had intersected perfectly with human emotion. Together, they had captured hearts in a way he could never have anticipated. News outlets reached out. Interviews were scheduled not just with Reynolds but with Emma's parents. Local reporters arrived at their modest home, careful not to overwhelm the child. When asked about the viral clip, Reynolds was cautious, but he emphasized Max's heroism. "The dog does what he's trained to do," he said. "But sometimes the world needs to see it through the eyes of someone who notices, even if they're only 3. Emma's parents shared what they could. "She's just a little girl," her mother explained. "She doesn't understand fame. She just notices things the way kids do. But it seems that noticing really matters." The media coverage painted the scene as a story of empathy, patience, and courage. Across the country, people were captivated. Parents posted their own children's stories. Teachers shared how they observed small moments of insight from toddlers, and dog owners highlighted the extraordinary capabilities of K-9 officers. The clip inspired conversations about trust, both human and animal, and the unseen bonds between law enforcement and their partners in fur. In schools, teachers used the story as a lesson. "Even the smallest voices matter," read one newsletter. "Children can teach adults about bravery, honesty, and noticing what's right." Emma's story became a symbol of innocence intersecting with duty, a reminder that even in serious matters like justice, human connection cannot be overlooked. Meanwhile, Max continued his duties. He went on patrols, tracked evidence, and attended training sessions. Yet something had changed in the K-9 unit. Officers noticed how he carried himself differently, more assured than before, as if he knew he had impressed not just humans but an entire community. Reynolds chuckled quietly when he noticed the effect. "I think the world made him famous," he whispered, scratching behind Max's ears. Max tilted his head, eyes calm, tail wagging slowly. Emma, unaware of the full scale of the attention, remained her curious, bright self. She drew pictures of Max every day, coloring him with exaggerated ears, a badge on his chest, and a determined look. Her parents pinned these drawings on the refrigerator and in frames around the house. "She understands him," her mother said softly one evening. "Better than anyone else, maybe even us." Community events followed. The police department invited Emma and her family to participate in a K-9 demonstration at the local park. Children lined up to meet Max, petting him under Reynolds' watchful eye. Emma stayed by his side the entire time, small hand resting gently on his fur, her eyes wide with reverence. Volunteers and onlookers whispered about the unusual bond between the toddler and the dog, marveling at her calm authority. "She doesn't just admire him," one officer said. "She sees him." By now, the story had reached national news. Morning shows aired segments highlighting both Max's achievements and Emma's seemingly simple but profound observations. Psychologists and child development experts discussed how even very young children can perceive subtle truths, reminding adults to pay attention to voices often overlooked. Commentary filled op-eds. "A 3-year-old shows us what justice really means. Innocence and bravery. Lessons from a toddler and a K-9, and waiting can be heroic. Max and Emma teach us patience." Emma's parents were careful to shield her from too much exposure, but small moments remained. At a bookstore, a mother approached and said, "Your daughter, she reminds us all to notice what matters." Emma's eyes widened at the compliment, but she didn't fully understand. "I just like dogs," she replied simply. The mother smiled, seeing the wisdom in the child's unassuming words. At the police department, Max became a symbol of dedication and heroism beyond the call of duty. The K-9 unit shared images of him on patrol, but more importantly, of him sitting quietly beside a small child, teaching the world in silence what courage and patience look like. Officers told stories of other K-9 partners, drawing parallels, emphasizing how much children could teach adults about observation and trust. The video of Emma pointing at Max became a training reference in some departments, a reminder that sometimes the quietest moments speak louder than commands or demonstrations. Even within the courtroom community, the ripple effect was noticeable. Judges, clerks, and bailiffs spoke of the story repeatedly, often citing it as an example of the unexpected ways humanity can touch legal proceedings. Some attorneys admitted that Emma's innocent gesture had reframed their understanding of the case, reminding them that law is not only about evidence, but also about the people and creatures who serve it, sometimes silently, sometimes patiently. Back at home, Emma clutched a new drawing of Max, this one showing him wearing a superhero cape. Her mother laughed quietly. "You think he's a hero, huh?" Emma nodded solemnly. "Because he waits. Waiting is brave," she said. Her father smiled, realizing that the lesson had been learned well. Bravery is not only in action, it is in stillness, in patience, and in watching over others when no one notices. The story continued to grow, but Emma remained grounded. Fame, media coverage, social attention, none of it seemed to matter to her. She cared about Max, about noticing, and about the small, quiet truths that others overlooked. And in doing so, she taught a nation an extraordinary lesson, that courage and insight can come from the unlikeliest sources, and that a child's perspective, when combined with a faithful companion, can illuminate truths adults often miss. As weeks turned into months, Emma and Max became almost inseparable whenever public appearances were scheduled. Children came to meet them, reporters sought interviews, and yet the heart of it remained the same: the quiet connection between a small girl and a patient, brave K9. That connection had transformed a routine courtroom hearing into a national story about observation, patience, and the extraordinary in the ordinary. Some nights Reynolds would take Max for a long walk through the quiet streets. He would reflect on the past few weeks, the viral videos, the media attention, the discussions in schools and offices across the country. But more than anything, he reflected on the child who had seen something adults could not, and on how a dog had responded, not just as a trained officer, but as a silent teacher, showing the world the quiet power of observation and the value of patience. Emma, meanwhile, slept with her drawings of Max pinned to the walls around her bed. In dreams, she imagined forests and fields where the dog ran freely, tracking trails, pausing, waiting, always calm. And in those dreams, she knew the truth she had discovered that day in court. Bravery often comes quietly, and even the smallest among us can see it. The courtroom had long emptied, but the story that began with a tiny finger pointing at a K9 was far from over. Emma and Max's moment had become more than a viral clip or a human interest story. It had become a symbol, a reminder that courage, patience, and truth could come in the quietest forms, from the youngest witnesses, and from the most disciplined companions. Emma had returned to her daily life, but nothing was quite the same. People approached her in stores, parks, and school, recognizing her instantly from the videos. She didn't fully understand why, but she smiled politely, usually saying, "I like dogs," and moving on. The adults around her, however, whispered about bravery, innocence, and how small actions could teach lessons adults often overlooked. Max returned to his routines as well: patrols, search and rescue drills, training sessions. But he was different too. Officer Reynolds noticed subtle changes: the way Max's posture carried more authority, the quiet confidence in his movements, even when the stakes were high. The world had watched him, and he had passed the unspoken test with grace, patience, and courage. One crisp autumn morning, the local police department organized a public demonstration to show the K9 unit in action. Families arrived, children laughing and running, eager to meet the dogs they had seen on screens. Emma clutched her mother's hand tightly, dragging her small sneakers across the grass to reach Max. When she reached him, she didn't run ahead like other children. She didn't shout or call his name. She knelt slowly, hands outstretched, and patted his head gently. Max sat perfectly still, ears forward, eyes calm. He exhaled slowly, tail wagging once, just enough to reassure her. "You remembered me," Emma whispered softly. Max didn't answer, of course, but in that moment no words were needed. Officer Reynolds stood beside them, watching quietly. He had seen countless K-9s work tirelessly, save lives and detect threats. But this bond between a 3-year-old girl and a German shepherd was something he hadn't anticipated. "You see," he said softly, more to himself than anyone else, "this is why we do it. Not for awards, not for recognition, but for moments like this." Emma's parents smiled, watching her small fingers trace the outline of Max's ears, her eyes alight with admiration. "She really understands him," her mother said, voice low, almost reverent. And she did. Emma understood bravery in its purest form, waiting when others rushed, observing when others acted impulsively, trusting when others doubted. Max embodied all of it, and together they had created a quiet legacy. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the city skyline, Emma sat at her desk, coloring another picture of Max. She drew him larger this time, cape and badge included, surrounded by people she imagined were safe because of him. Her mother peeked in. "He's lucky to have you noticing him," she said softly. Emma didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head, considering. "I think everyone should notice bravery," she said finally, and returned to her coloring. Her words, simple as they were, carried the same clarity that had silenced a courtroom weeks before. The story of Emma and Max continued to ripple outward. Local schools invited her parents to speak about the experience, not as a lecture, but as a conversation about observation, patience, and noticing the unnoticed. Children asked questions about Max, about police dogs, and about courage. Adults, in turn, marveled at how a child's insight could simplify something complex, teaching lessons that textbooks often overlooked. National media followed up with interviews featuring Officer Reynolds, emphasizing the critical role K-9 units play in law enforcement. Max's heroics were highlighted, but always in tandem with the story of Emma's quiet observation. Together, the girl and the dog reminded viewers that heroism is not always loud, and that the most profound truths can come from the unlikeliest sources. One day, a local community center organized a storytelling event. Emma was invited with her parents' guidance to participate. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped to the small stage, her drawing of Max tucked under her arm. She didn't use a microphone. She didn't recite prepared lines. She simply held up the drawing and said, softly, clearly, "This is Max, he waits. Waiting is brave." The audience was silent for a heartbeat, then erupted in applause. Children clapped, some mimicking a dog sitting. Adults smiled, many with tears in their eyes. The message was simple, yet profound. Courage and patience are not measured by noise or aggression, but by focus, calm, and steadfastness in the face of uncertainty. Officer Reynolds watched from the back, quietly proud. Max sat at his side, calm as ever, seemingly aware of the attention yet unfazed. Together they had become teachers, showing the world what trust, patience, and observation could accomplish. In the months that followed, the story of the courtroom incident remained a touchstone in the community. Workshops on K-9 training included a segment on observation inspired by Emma's moment. Law enforcement departments highlighted the viral courtroom clip in training materials, emphasizing the importance of focus and restraint. Families across the country shared similar stories, recognizing that children, even the very young, could see truths adults often missed. And Emma, she continued to live her small, wonderful life, always noticing, always observing, always quietly teaching in her own way. Every visit to Max reinforced the same lesson. Waiting, watching, and trusting are not passive actions. They are courageous choices that require patience, wisdom, and heart. The courtroom, once a place of formality and law, had changed forever, for those present and for those who would witness the story through videos and news articles. Justice had been served, yes, but in a way that transcended legal outcomes. It had been amplified by innocence, recognized by a child, and embodied by a loyal, steadfast K-9. Years later, Emma would remember that day not for the verdict or the court proceedings, but for Max sitting quietly, waiting and acknowledging her in a subtle, profound way. She would carry that lesson into adulthood, understanding that the truest forms of bravery often go unnoticed, yet they matter more than anyone realizes. And Max, he remained a hero, not just because of what he did, but because someone had noticed, someone had understood, and someone had said so out loud. In the end, the courtroom moment, the tiny finger, the patient dog, and the wise little girl became more than a story. They became a legacy. A legacy of patience, observation, courage, and connection. A legacy proving that sometimes, the smallest voices and quietest actions can resonate louder than the loudest arguments, shaping hearts, minds, and even justice itself. Emma held her drawings of Max close, smiling. The world outside was big and complicated, but she had learned the most important lesson. Noticing, waiting, and trusting. Those were brave acts in their own right. And Max, faithful as ever, reminded her daily that even the most disciplined hero could pause to teach, if only someone was watching. And the world watched.